Hey guys, welcome back to Unit 4, where we're talking about exploring the power of descriptive language and other people's work since we worked on it in our creative writing earlier. This is Lesson 5, and there's a slight difference between what we were working on in Lessons 3 and 4 and what we're going to look at in Lesson 5. So in Lessons 3 and 4, we talked about interpreting imagery and word choice or diction and the impacts that that has on the setting. In Lesson 5, we're going to talk about interpreting imagery and word choice or diction and the effects that those have on character. So we're going to do a lot of very similar things that we did in the previous lessons, which means that some of that stuff won't take us as long to get through, but then the practice will be a little bit more, we'll expect a little bit more of you at once, whereas it was broken up in the previous lessons. So let's get started. We're going to read this excerpt from Fahrenheit 451, which is in your student reader. So if you haven't done so yet, maybe you should open up the student reader. It's available on Canvas for you, and this is from page 16 of the student reader. It's a very short reading example. So we'll start with that. But before we do, I want to just get some thinking questions out of the way. So they're very similar to the questions that we had for the previous lessons where we were talking about the setting. It's just that we've replaced setting with character now. So the question, how does imagery create the character in this excerpt? So we'll be looking for how sights and sounds and tastes and smells and other sensations for this character named Montag, who I don't think is named in, no, he's not named in this short excerpt, but I can just tell you Fahrenheit 451, very famous book by Ray Bradbury, and the main character's name is Montag, so this is all about him. The second question is, how does diction create the character in the excerpt? So specific words that distinguish Montag's individuality, what choices are being made to really characterize Montag as an individual here. And then the last thing that we'll want to do again is to think, okay, now that I have these examples of imagery and diction as they pertain to the character of Montag, what adjectives might I use to describe Montag? So let's go ahead and take a look at this example. I'll read it out loud and you should follow along. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head, and his eyes all orange flame, with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter, and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeon-winged books died on the porch and lawn of the house, while the books went up in sparkling whirls and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning. Montag grinned the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. So this is a book about burning books and censorship and things like that. You can get the sense of that already. And although you don't necessarily know a lot about that yet, you can get a sense of who this guy is who's doing that. So let's just look briefly at, let's take imagery first, and just some things that I'm noticing here. I'm noticing the visual of, oops, let's try that again. I'm noticing the visual of seeing things. Oh, why? I'm trying to highlight. Let me try one more time. Seeing things, there we go, blackened and changed. So that visual, sense of burning, or flame, I guess. This great python spitting venomous kerosene. That's a hose that sprays kerosene, which is basically gas. Blood pounding in his head is a sensation, right? His hands, uh, the hands of some amazing conductor. You can see his hands kind of waving. Uh, uh, tatters and charcoal of the ruins of history, right? Like this rain of, I guess, bringing down the tatters and charcoal of the ruins of history. Um, uh, his eyes all orange flame, right? So the visual of the flames in his eyes. The house jumping up and gorging on the fire of the evening sky that's red and black. Um, the swarm of fireflies, all these visuals of just, the air around him, and you could even maybe feel the thickness of the air. I'll do one more here. I won't get all of them, but like, the sparkling whirls, that blew away on the wind. This, the visual of embers, glowing embers on the wind. So that's all kind of cool. And then if we look for specific diction, right, what am I noticing here? I'm noticing the word pleasure comes up a couple of times. I'm noticing the word spitting, and I'm noticing, let's see, blazing and burning, and I'm noticing gorging, a couple more here. I'm noticing, let's see, pounded. I'm noticing fierce. Kind of negatively connotated words to go along with it. Now the question is, what does that all have to do with character? I'm going to have to go back through and kind of say, like, are these images telling me about the character? Are these diction choices telling me about the character? But it at least gives me something to think about as I'm trying to determine, how does the imagery create the character in the excerpt? How does the diction create the character in the excerpt? And then going forward, how would I describe this character? So I'm really noticing a lot of imagery and diction. Now I have to really kind of think about how it applies to the character. So we're going to return to this web that we worked on with setting in the previous lessons, and we're just going to kind of do the same thing. So, I've thought about it a little bit, and I've said, well, what kind of character is Montag based on what I just read? And I think I'm going to start with this word sinister. He seems very, sinister is I guess a fancy word for like negative, bad, has evil intentions, isn't looking out for things, and that seems like a reasonable description of this guy Montag from where we started, just with those first few, paragraphs, I guess, sentences that we got from this story. So where am I getting that? Well, I noticed the word pleasure, which is there, and I'll come back to that in just a second. He says it twice in the first two sentences, so I think it's probably important. I cited it as paragraph 1, but it's also in paragraph 2. I also noticed the word venomous from paragraph 2, and I noticed the word fierce in paragraph 3. And not to say that those are the only diction choices, obviously there are more. When you talk about sinister, you're talking about somebody who takes pleasure in pain, in the causing of suffering. And so if you look at pleasure and venomous and fierce, you get both of those sides of it. In terms of imagery, what I'm looking at to create this kind of sinister sense of Montag, I look at the image of to see things blackened and changed, the visual of things changing to nothing, to basically ash in the fire, books especially changing to ash in a fire. And I apologize for the size of this, it's a little bit small, but this quote also from paragraph 2, his hands flicked the igniter and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. In that you get the sensation, if you've ever clicked a lighter, knowing what that feels like, and the flame kind of going up, but also you get the the heat of the flame jumping up and engorging this house that's been doused in kerosene. You get the image, the visual of the sky turning these kind of fiery colors of red and yellow and black. So there's a lot of imagery going along there from something that this character has caused. And then finally, I chose this. He wanted to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace while the flapping pigeon-winged books died on the porch lawn. So this kind of emotional sensation of the pleasure, the kind of joy that we take in making s'mores, roasting marshmallows, but the also the sense of these, the image of these dying books just kind of fluttering or floating to the ground amidst his pleasure. I think all of that imagery really, goes to show this, this guy who, on the one hand, is causing massive destruction but also taking joy in it in a very sinister way. So if I chose diction and imagery to describe Montag, if I did that, I think I would come away with a sense of Montag really kind of being a sinister person. So if we move on then to the next step that we did last week, where we take our interpretations to the next level, right? Like, okay, we have an idea of what we may expect from Montag. We have these diction and imagery examples. I won't read them again to you. I'm just going to show you kind of here on this flow chart these diction and imagery examples of a character who has been created as sinister. Then what really could we learn or could we expect from him? Like, what's the point of all of this? What's the point of this activity? And that's where the thesis comes in. So I wrote this thesis. Since Ray Bradbury uses diction and imagery to characterize Montag as sinister, so that's part 1, right? We would be able to prove that. Readers of this introduction may feel afraid of his character. Okay, that seems reasonable. We can probably take examples of diction, show how they prove that he's sinister, and then extend that to a sense of fear about his character. But expect him to grow into someone who is more sympathetic. Remember that we expect characters to grow, to change, to evolve throughout a story. So we may say, well, if he's starting off as sinister, maybe he's going to change into somebody who's less sinister or more sympathetic, that we like a little bit more. So that's my prediction. And I could, if I wanted, write a whole essay on this, right? So my essay might look like, I've got my introduction, I would place my thesis at the bottom. And then again, this is from our last lesson, you should already know this, but one way that we could break this thesis into a very basic essay is to write one body paragraph about how diction characterizes him as sinister, and then relate that diction and sinister sensation of him to how it's creating a sense of fear about this character. We would do the same thing with imagery, how it's creating the sinister character of Montag, or reinforcing the sinister character of Montag, and also feeding into the reader's sense of fear. We could do it that way. And then in the concluding paragraph, then we could take that and say, well, how do we grow? How do we, if we know this about Montag, what could we possibly learn and engage with as he goes through his journey? And that's where we might conclude this particular essay. So that's one possibility. Now, I've basically walked you through this example. You're going to do this with a separate example, And that example is from, golly, that's small and I apologize for it, but it's from the student reader on page 14, from an excerpt of a piece of writing called Out of My Mind. And this is a different piece of writing, obviously. This one by Sharon Draper, who is also a poet. So you can expect some kind of poetic license being taken here. But the questions remain the same. So your job this time is to, I'll read it out loud and that'll be the end, but then your practice online will be to go through and basically do what I just did with Montag and Fahrenheit 451 for this character of Melody in this excerpt for Out of My Mind. So our questions are, how does imagery create the character in this excerpt? We're looking for sights, sounds, tastes, smells, sensations that are related to the character of Melody. We're asking ourselves, how does diction create the character in this excerpt? So specific words that distinguish Melody's individuality. And then how might you combine those to describe, to use an adjective to describe Melody? And remember that Melody is, that you'll be then taking that to write a thesis as well. So just be aware that that's all coming up. So here's the excerpt from Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper. Words. I'm surrounded by thousands of words, maybe millions. Cathedral, mayonnaise, pomegranate, Mississippi, Neapolitan, hippopotamus, silky, terrifying, iridescent, tickle, sneeze, wish, worry. Words have always swirled around me like snowflakes, each one delicate and different, each one melting, untouched in my hands. Deep within me, words pile up in huge drifts, mountains of phrases and sentences and connected ideas, clever expressions, jokes, love songs. From the time I was really little, maybe just a few months old, words were like sweet liquid gifts, and I drank them like lemonade. I could almost taste them. They made my jumbled thoughts and feelings have substance. My parents have always blanketed me with conversation. They chattered and babbled. They verbalized and vocalized. My father sang to me. My mother whispered her strength. Every word my parents spoke to me or about me I absorbed and kept and remembered, all of them. I have no idea how I untangled the complicated process of words and thought, but it happened quickly and naturally. By the time I was 2, all my memories had words, and all my words had meanings, but only in my head. I have never spoken one single word. I am almost 11 years old. All right. So again, your job is now to go through and to complete the work for this that I did as an example for Fahrenheit 451. You can find that work on Canvas. I look forward to seeing what you get done.